Good evening, all. On behalf of the Cultural Committee, Barasat Government College, I warmly welcome you to this international webinar on Ray Across Borders, Music and Memory. This time, the time is out of joint, to borrow from Shakespeare, and we are experiencing unprecedented devastation. Many of our colleagues, students, families, friends have been affected variously by the pandemic. Yet, wars and apocalypse could never crush the human spirit, and the present crisis too shall pass. The centenary of a personality like Satyajit Rai is a cultural milestone, and it adds to our life forces. We have gathered here to celebrate a life that has touched ours in many different ways and continues to do so. I extend our greetings to Professor Ahmed Ahsanuজ্জামান and Professor Abhijit Rai, our esteemed speakers. Our first session will be with Professor Ahsanuজ্জামান, chaired by Dr. Shati Mitro. However, before that, I would request our Honorable Principal, Dr. Shomar Chattopadhyay, to address the audience. Sir.
হ্যাঁ স্যার, ইউ আর অডিবল।
হ্যাঁ, সত্যজিৎ রায় তো একজন সত্যজিৎ রায় একজন বিরাট ব্যক্তিত্ব। আমি একটা বার্ড রিভিউ করছিলাম, আমরা যেভাবে জানি তো করতে গিয়ে দেখি তো করতে গিয়ে দেখি যে মানে এই ওনার পরে কিছু স্পেশালিস্ট হওয়াই সম্ভব না। আমি মানে অনেক পুরনো দেশ কালেক্ট করছিলাম, তো কিছু কিছু দেখছি বইও বেরিয়েছে, যেমন মারি সিটন দেখছি একটা মনুমেন্টাল ওয়ার্ক করেছে, পোর্ট্রেট অফ হিস্ট্রি। তো এর ভলিউম, আমার জন্ম 1921 সালে, প্রথম ডাকনাথ ছিল প্রসাদ। তো সমকালীন সময়ে সমকালীন বাঙালিদের স্বীকৃতি এবং বিশ্ব স্বীকৃতি খুব কম লোক পায়। সত্যজিৎ রায়ের যে পুরস্কারের ভান্ডারটা দেখতে গিয়ে আমরা মানে মানে প্রত্যেকটা চিত্রই প্রায় দু একটা বাদে পুরস্কার পেয়েছে। তো টিচারও দেখছি মারি রয়েছে, সেখানে লিখে খুব আশ্চর্য। একবারই শিক্ষক উনি যখন আসেন তখন মানে স্কুলে ইন্টারভিউ সত্যজিৎ রায়, তো বললেন যে কি দেখেছো, তো বলল যে আমি লাইন দেখেছি, কারণ ট্রাম লাইন একটা নির্দিষ্ট গতি চলে। তো 1936 সালে দেখছি যে উড পেপার ক্যামেরায় ছবি লাভ করেন। বিভিন্ন দিক নিয়ে আমাদের বক্তারা আছে, কিছু দিক এত অল্প সময়, তো একটা দিক নিয়ে বেশি বোধহয় আলোচনা, সেইটা নিয়ে আমি একটু বলবো। সবাই সার্ফেস জানে সত্যজিৎ 17 খিলাড়ি উনারা দাবা পড়ে চেসের উপরে উনি একটা করেছিলেন। তো সেইটার একটা আর কি সেই দাবা থেকে আসে, সেটা হচ্ছে উনি বিজ্ঞাপন সংস্থা কাজ করছেন এবং সেই সময় একজন বন্ধু, তার নাম হচ্ছে নন ক্লেয়ার, তার সাথে উনি তৎকালীন বিশ্ব, তারপরে এই পাবলাঙ্কা এমন কিন্তু সব তার ছিল হচ্ছে পল। তো একটা ওয়ার্ল্ড চ্যাম্পিয়নের মোটামুটি জীবনী এবং ওয়ার্ল্ড চ্যাম্পিয়ন তাদের আমার সম্বন্ধে পড়া আছে, পড়তে গিয়ে আমার খুব ইন্টারেস্টিং লাগলো এই জায়গাটাতে। এবং উনি এবং মিখাইল তাল এবং ববি ফিশার রিলিজ করতে দেখতে দেখতে খুব রোম্যান্টিক তাল এবং খুব খুব প্র্যাকটিক্যাল এবং ওনার কিন্তু খুব এই যে সমাদৃত, কিন্তু খেলা ওনার তো পড়ার জীবনীটাতে দেখছি যে ইউসে রাহুল কাপা প্লাস ছিলেন, প্র্যাকটিক্যাল ব্লেন্ড ইন্টারভিউ ওভেন আছে, এইরকম একটা চরিত্র সত্যজিৎ রায় বোধহয় সারা জীবন ধরে ওনার মধ্যে এনগ্রেভড হয়েছিল। তো সেইটার জন্যই উনি দাবাটাকে ওই প্রচন্ড কাজের জন্য আর কন্টিনিউ করতে পারেনি, কিন্তু সেই চিহ্নটা উনি রেখে যান শতরঞ্জ খিলাড়িতে। তো এরপরে চেস নিয়ে অনেক বই আছে, বার্টম্যানের দ্য সেভেন্থ একটা বই, সে যে নায়ক তার মৃত্যুর সঙ্গে খেলছিলেন আর কি। তো সেভেন সিল, তা আমার মনে হয় সত্যজিৎ রায় তার মৃত্যুর সঙ্গেই দাবা খেলছেন। মৃত্যুটা 100 বছর হয়ে গেছে হয়নি, এবং আগামী তো কয়েকশো বছর চলতে থাকবে, এবং ওনার এই দাবা খেলাটা চলতে থাকবে। এবং ওনাকে যখন কমেন্ট করতে বলা হয়, উনি কোনো কমেন্ট করেননি, জাস্ট হেসেছিলেন। তো এটুকু বলে আমি বাংলাদেশ আমাদের ইন্ডিপেন্ডেন্ট ইউনিভার্সিটি অধ্যাপক আছেন হাসুজ্জামান সাহেব, এবং আমাদের প্রফেসর অভিজিৎ রায় আছেন যাদবপুর ইউনিভার্সিটি ফিল্ড স্টাডিজ, তাদেরকে আমি অসংখ্য ধন্যবাদ জানাচ্ছি তাদের মূল্যবান সময় ব্যয় করে এই আলোচনায় অংশ নেওয়ার জন্য, আমাদেরকে হাত প্রসারিত করার জন্য, এবং তারা আমাদেরকে অনেকটাই এনরিচ করবেন এবং আলোকিত করবেন। এবং আমরা যদি এটা সামনাসামনি করতে পারতাম, তো আমরা খুব অন্তত বিশাল একটা হল প্যাকড স্টুডেন্ট টিচার এবং একটা বিশাল একটা জায়গা করতে পারতাম।
Thank you, sir. And I think sir has mentioned both the times as well as the fact that we are so very sad that we had to hold this in a platform like this. But a warm welcome again to the speakers, especially Professor Ahmed Asanusaman, who has agreed to speak to us about Ray, and he has decided to speak on my own Satyajit Rai, so Ray and memory. So it's the memory of our title which Professor Ahmad Asanusaman will be addressing. And Professor Ahmad Asanusaman is a professor of English, Khulna University, Bangladesh. Currently, he's on loan to Independent University, Bangladesh, which is the IUB Dhaka. He is a translator of theatre and performance studies scholar, as well as a literary and cultural theory enthusiast. Professor Hassanuzzahman graduated in English from Dhaka University, and he obtained his MPhil and PhD from Oslo University, Norway. He has acted as the Dean of Arts and Humanities School, the head of English discipline, the director of Fine Arts Institute, and as well the director of Institutional Quality Assurance Cell of Kolkata University. He has presented many papers in a number of international conferences and seminars in Bangladesh, India, Hong Kong, China, Australia, and in Europe, namely Norway and Denmark. With Professor Fakhrul Alam, he has co-edited Translation Studies Exploring Identities in 2015. He has also edited Norway Golpo, an anthology of translation of Norwegian stories in Bengali. He has directed Ibsen's An Enemy of the People, 2006, A Doll's House, 2017, and Shakespeare's Hamlet, 2018. Professor Ahsanuzzahman is also the chief editor of the referred online quarterly literary magazine Literary Bed, I hope I got that right, which is set to float in autumn this year. A very, very warm welcome to Professor Ahmed Ahsanuzzahman, and it is up on to him now to take on and address this very wide audience who is collected here. He's going to speak on My Satyajit Ray. Sir, sir, you're muted, sir.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
So, just give me a second. Uh, can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir, we can.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, Good evening, and thank you very much for inviting me to this centenary webinar on Satyajit Ray. I would like to offer my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Shati Mitra because it was she who took my phone number from Professor Krishna Sen of Kolkata University and contacted me if I could join this seminar. I didn't hesitate at all and said I would, as Satyajit Rai is very close to my heart. In fact, I and the likes of me grew up reading Satyajit Rai, and also watching his films. My thanks to the principal of Barasat Government College and the cultural committee which has arranged this program. I would also like to extend my thanks to the speaker. And the speaker we have today, Professor Abhijit Rai of Rajabishi University. Namaskar, Professor Abhijit Rai. This is a wonderful occasion. Yes, we are doing it virtually, but this is how we try to come to terms with situations. Shruti Roy is an exceptional personality, and his centenary cannot go unattended. He has to be celebrated, and that's what you are doing today. My congratulations. Well, the title of my paper is My Own Satyajit Rai. There's reason for coming up with this title. Let me make it quite clear at the very beginning that I am not a Satyajit Rai expert, nor am I an expert on film studies. So what I would be doing here today is kind of a engaging with Shruti Rai from my own personal perspective. As I told the beginning, I grew up reading him and also watching his films. But before moving on to my personalized experience with Shruti Rai, I would like to I'd like to introduce the audience with our directors, our filmmakers who were influenced by Shruti Rai. So it's going to be kind of a journey from macro to micro level. That is how our directors, our filmmakers were inspired by Shruti Rai, and how we as youngsters got to know Shruti Rai in the 70s of the previous century. Well, this is Pother Pachali, which was released in 1955, and this is, as everyone would say, a landmark achievement, not only in Bengali cinema, but possibly in South Asian cinema. It has inspired a host of directors, filmmakers, actors and actresses across South Asia. And this was the film which inspired a lot of Bengali filmmakers in Bangladesh, in East Pakistan, today's Bangladesh. So this is how I would like to talk about the legacy of this great filmmaker. The Oppo trilogy set a new standard of filmmaking for the Bengali directors in the day then Pakistan. And also the directors in post-independence Bangladesh were well informed of Rai's films. Rai's legacy continues in today's Bangladesh in what has come to be known as art cinema. Referring to film historians Kabir and Hayat, Zakir Hussain Raju informs us that Pother Pachali, I quote, was seen as the model for making of Asia. Asia is a film which was produced in 1960. Unquote. He adds, I quote, like the famous scene of Pother Pachali, in which the young protagonist watch a train for the first time in their lives. In Asia, also, two adolescents look at a train passing their village and play on the railway lines. The scene was emphasized by the extreme long shot of the train and the big close-up of the feet of the young children on the railway lines. My emphasis. In an informal interview on mobile phone, media and film studies scholar Raju, who is also a colleague and friend, told me, I quote, so far as narration and cinematography are concerned, the Oppo trilogy has had a lasting impact on the filmmakers of Bangladesh. However, the legendary Japanese film director Akira Kurosawa's intense reminiscence about Pother Pachali's effect on him 20 years after its release may perhaps explain why it made such a special appeal to our directors. I quote, it is a kind of cinema that flows with the serenity and nobility of a big braver. Without the least effort and without any sudden jerks, Rai paints his picture, but its effect on the audience is terrible, deep passion. It's quoted in Henry Robinson. According to Anwar Hossain Pinto, a writer and a Rai lover and scholar, I quote, had there been no Pother Pachali, Bengali film would not have secured the prestige it enjoys in today's cinema world. In an informal interview with me on mobile phone in the morning, I mean today, Pinto, who published Satyajit Rabindranath, on behalf of Satyajit Charcha Kendra, his brainchild, in 2002, talked at length about Satyajit's influence on our filmmakers. He said, I quote, Satyajit is the towering director whose presence is inevitable in the films that we pride on. His simple yet sophisticated way of storytelling, unique cinematography, and his discovery of Bengal in a diverse city cannot be surpassed. Our talented directors, in their best moments of creativity, rediscover him. Pin to single out Shruti Digolbari, Domina's House, which was released in 1979, which followed the Oputilosi extensively. Not only did it draw on a near similar theme, but also made use of Rai's composition. He said Moshiuddin Shakir, who directed it jointly with Sheikh Niamat Ali, had told him that the foreign film critics dubbed it as Pother Pachili Bangladesh when it premiered in an international film festival abroad. For Pinto, Chutil being filmic and never theatrical has been able to inspire and influence the filmmakers of Bangladesh as well as India and other parts of the world. Besides, he is diverse. I quote, his diversity is perhaps unmatched, unquote, for which reason filmmakers, regardless of place and time, will look forward to him, unquote. Yet another feature which draws filmmakers to shooting is his unusual sense of portraying details. He is indeed the master when it comes to presenting details. Filming of tiny details, including the box covered with the cobweb in Pothir Pachali, make it a wonderful visual experience, and doing which is a temptation which directors can hardly resist. So this is what Anwar Hassan Pinto told me. So he is a Shakir scholar and researcher in Bangladesh. Having said that, I will I will take the audience through a tour in which I will show you some film covers. The films were directly or indirectly inspired by Shruti Rai. Well, there are obviously more films which I have not been able to include, and the reason for that is that the films which I have not seen, I have not included. So what I am going to, I mean, the covers that I'll be showing you are of those films which I have seen. And as I told you, there must have been other films which are not included here because I have not seen them. And then, of course, there are films which I have seen, but I have not been able to include here. So my apologies to the directors, because if I could, this would have been obviously more resourceful. And of course, when I'm presenting these covers, it is implied that these are my own choices. So people belonging to other quarters may have other preferences. They may include films which I have not included, so which is quite understandable. So with this disclaimer, I would like to guide you through a journey. So this is covers gallery, and Shuttle's Oputilosi were over by 1959, because 1955 it was Pothir Pachali, 56 Aparajito, and then of course Shamshai 59. And this is one of the films which is a family drama, but as far as its cinematography, storytelling is concerned, it's obviously inspired by Shruti Rai. And then of course Shutarang is another film which bears, imprint of Shutdi. And this is Asia, about which I have just told. That is, it was a film which was directly inspired by Satyajit Rai. And then the other one is by Johir Raihan, and it was released in 1970. And importantly, it's a kind of political satire. And from that perspective, it's kind of a force. I mean, it kind of. It is a movie which generated a lot of enthusiasm when it was released, because it was a time when whole nation was eagerly anticipating liberation of Bangladesh, and Johir Raihan made a political satire, and it was a brilliant success. And as you would see, in 1980, Satyajit Rai would be doing Hero Rajabishi, which is perhaps the most beautiful political satires that I have ever seen. So this is what Fahmida Akhtar writes about Johir Raihan's film. It captures the crucial moment of Pakistani liberation by presenting the national experiences and exploitation of Bengalis under the military dictatorship of Ayub Khan. And then this is Orayagarajan by Chashi Nuzul Islam, which was released in 1972. That is just the year after liberation. And this is by Alamgir Kabir, Dhire Bohe Meghna. Both are based on the liberation war of Bangladesh. But as far as the storytelling and cinematography and composition are concerned, they bear traces of or imprint of Satyajit Rai. These are once again two more movies which were based on our liberation war of 1971, Abartura Manushar by Khanataur Rahman. And as far as framing or delivery of the content is concerned, this as well as Megaronic Rome were inspired by Satyajit Rai. Khanataur Rahman also did some more remarkable films. For example, there's one which is one of the all-time box office hit, Sujan Shoki. And so this is once again a remarkable feat, and that in that film as well, he tried to capture the spirit of Satyajit Rai as far as his filming and narrative is concerned. And then in 1978 came Gulab Yakin Trene by Amjad Hussain, and this is a kind of a phenomenal, this kind of phenomena. And even after all these years, people talk about Gulab Yakin Trene because it set a kind of a standard. But the rail line, the railway tracks, as well as the storytelling, everything would indicate that it was influenced by Satyajit Rai. And then, of course, Sarin Bo is based on Shudala Kaisar's novel of the same title. It was directed by Abdullah Mamun, and then Shujud Dugul Bari, about which I told in the introduction. These two were once again films bearing reflection of Chutli. And in the 1990s, we have several works, several films, notable among which are Ekature Jishu by Nasruddin Yusuf, and also Agune Poroshmuni by Humayun Ahmed. And then we come to Tanvir Mukammal, his Chitranudir Pare, as well as Lalon, and also Nodir Nam Modhumuti, bear direct testimony to. I mean, it's these are the films which are influenced by Satyajit Rai. And also he has done some other landmark productions, landmark films, which in a way or the other bears Satyajit's legacy. And this is Martin Moyna, The Clay Bird by Tariq Masood, and then Fagun Hawa in a Spring Breeze by Tokir Ahmed. So this is, as I told you, there must have been many more plays. For example, I didn't talk about Moshid Islam. Moshid Islam did some remarkable productions, including Amar Bundhu Rashid. I just couldn't, talk about all this. I didn't include all this, but they are definitely influenced by Shakespeare, Satyajit Rai. Now I would come to my own Satyajit. Rajabishi was the first film by Satyajit I watched. Bangladesh television aired it in 1981. It mesmerized the likes of me. An anecdote here will perhaps show how, with incredible enthusiasm, I awaited its broadcast. Let me tell you that. I mean, the evening when it was scheduled to be aired, we were all, eagerly waiting for the broadcast. But suddenly, it was the power cut, and I I would not be able to tell you how we felt. So what I did, back in those days, we have this cassette player, right? So I tried to tune on FM and try to capture the signal on radio. It was very faint, and it was noisy. You could hardly, you could hardly, um, understand what was being told, but still I tried to listen to them. And then what happened when the electricity was back? I recorded the I mean what was left. So I recorded that. So this perhaps reveals how it meant to me and the generations I belong to. And since then, I watched it numerous times. Overnight, Hero Rajabishi became the talk of the town. His lines were memorized, they are customized to critic contemporary reality. In fact, Anwar Pinto said that university students had a go at the military dictator come President Joe Rahman by parading the campuses and the streets with the chant, Dori Dhore Marotan, Jia Hobe Khan Khan. In 2006, I translated, adapted, and directed a student production of Henry Gibson's An Enemy of the People at Kuala University. Rai's Ganushotru acted as a huge source of inspiration, and I paid a growing tribute to him in director's notes. The play is available on YouTube, and these are the links. Having said that, let me provide the theoretical perspective for my talk, and the basic perspective I draw from Homi Bhabha in the location of culture. Bhabha says that, I quote, there are many forms of political writing whose different effects are obscured when they're divided between the theoretical and the activist. For him, the activist manifesto expressed in a leaflet, and the writer's, I quote, speculative article on the theory of ideology are, I quote, both forms of discourse, quote, and they only differ, quote, in their operational qualities, unquote. Baba argues the leaflet has a specific expository and organizational purpose, temporarily bound to the event. The theory of ideology makes its contribution to those embedded political ideas and principles that inform the right to strike. The latter does not justify the former, nor does it necessarily precede it. It exists side by side with it, the one as an enabling part of the other, like the recto and verso of a sheet of paper, to use a common semiotic analogy in the uncommon context of politics. For Weber, the activist idea of politics is not in opposition to the writer's theoretical commitment to an ideology. Instead, the former is an enabling part of the latter, and vice versa. Rai's commitment to politics is shaped by his own ideological positioning as an intellectual within a discursive field which should not be confused with that of an activist. Unlike an activist, Rai is never loud. He is unlike his Diamond King, Utpal Datta, for whom theatre, and for that matter, any art cannot but be propagandist. For Rai, art should provide, Amartya argues, though in a different context, a platform for, I quote, broad public discussion and informed hesitation, unquote, by negotiating issues which people confront in society. So for me, Roy is political, and the political Roy has special significance in today's world, even in these days of pandemic. The first book by Satyajit Rai I read was Gorustane Shabdhan, probably in 1978, and I was fascinated by his plot and characters, especially by Feluda, Jatayu, and Shudhu Jetha. Then I read Professor Shunku, and I fell in love with Shunku's world. Now, the play which I single out is Hero Rajabishi. This is the play which I would say has a message which we need to take note of, and this is what's going to be the most contemporary of Chokhi's films. Why? In The Inner Eye, the biography of a master filmmaker, Andrew Robinson writes, for the Marxist Utpal Datta, the film was out and out political. For once, despite his aversion for labels and politics, Rai himself did not demur at the notion. He was willing to associate the scene in the film in which the king's soldiers drive away all the poor people so that visitors will not see them, with the bulldozing of the slums in Delhi and others during Indira Gandhi's 1975-7 emergency. In a fantasy, one can be forthright, he observed. But if you are dealing with contemporary characters, you can be articulate up to a point because it's necessary. You simply cannot attack the party in power. But in fantasy, you can have a go. I quote from Orwell's 1984, the Ministry of Peace concerns itself with war, the Ministry of Truth with lies, the Ministry of Love with torture, and the Ministry of Plenty with starvation. These contradictions are not accidental, nor do they result from ordinary advocacy. They are deliberate exercise in double think. But then again, you have a choice. A rat in a maze is free to go anywhere as long as it stays inside the maze. So I'm quoting from Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, which was published in 1985. The dystopia that Atwood presents and the dystopia that Orwell presents in 1984 have close proximity with Satyajit Roy's Rajabishi. Of course, Rajabishi ends on a positive note, is optimistic, and to understand Handmaid's Tale is optimistic. But then again, Rajabishi is social. The Diamond King brainwashes the citizen at Jantar Mantar in such a manner that all thoughts, including the thought of dissent, are erased from their consciousness. And like robots, they chant the regime's truths. The mantras, penned by the paid poet laureate, act as the only narrative which, depending on their respective profession, citizens are made to utter. Udayan Maharaj or Udayan Pundit skips brainwashing, and aided by Gopi and Bhagabain's magic, he stages a resistance. The king and his cronies are brainwashed instead. The dystopic Diamond Kingdom is toppled as the king joins hands to pull down his own statue, the symbol of totalitarianism. Dori dhore marotan, Raja hobe Khan Khan. The COVID-19 pandemic has given birth to a new world order. Humans are required to wear masks. Masks are increasingly becoming a familiar part of our life. The masked world is likely to move towards standardization. One grand narrative to erase all other narratives permanently. Will there be, however, another Udayan Pundit? So with this question, I will finish my presentation. And once again, I would like to offer my thanks to Barasat Government College for inviting me to this webinar. And as I said, I am not at all a shooting expert, nor am I a film critical expert. So what I did was out of love and passion for Satyajit. May the memories of Satyajit live forever. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Asanuzaman. That was, I think, a wonderful job that you've done completing your claim to be both a scholar and enthusiast of cinema and theatre. I think it was very enlightening for us as listeners because you gave us and pointed out how Bangladesh and Bangladesh filmmaking was affected or influenced by Ray and his works. So that is a legacy I think most of us were very keen on. And that series of posters that you showed us, which was in many ways, they were so very different from what we are comfortable, what we know to be Satyajit Ray's kind of film. But when you pointed out that how Ray's kind very idea of filmmaking had reflected in many of these films in many ways, I, for one, was familiar with Akatturi Jishu. I think many of us have heard of that one. But you did point out and link how Ray had influenced these mostly commendable and important Bangladesh films made in this time. You also went on to point out how these films also reflected the political scenario and the changing political scenario of Bangladesh in this time, as well as drew parallels with how Satyajit Ray's films have also reflected the political condition of India in many ways. And then you did what is most most happening in the literary world at this time, that is shifting from theory to life writing, of fiction to life writing. And you brought in your memory of a child who kind of looked into the wonders of Professor Shonku's world, and that itself must have been quite a walk down memory lane for many of the listeners, who must have also, like children, done the same. and and then you, as the scholar, you have also given us a brief literary a theorizing, a possibility of theorizing of Ray's films and their influence in Bangladesh. I think if there are keen people, they could take these up as mines to, plumb in future years, to see how Ray has influenced the films not only in Bengal and India, but even elsewhere. So thank you so much, Professor Ahsanuzaman. And if there are any questions, we would invite, at least we have time for one or two questions. So is there anybody who has a question to ask? From the participants, there are many students. So if there are anybody who would, yes.
Excuse me, if I may, I'm trying to raise my hand, but I don't know if it's showing.
It's all right, Gurshik, you can go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Shati Mitra, and thank you, Professor, for that very enlightening lecture. It was like Dr. Mitra has very nicely summarized. There were few that I wanted to also congratulate you on, but thank you for that. So I'll come directly to a very short and cryptic question. I was really fascinated, though we do discuss these points about the difference between an artist and an activist, and how Ray is probably not comfortable being an activist, if I understood your concept right, and how Utpal Datta was trying to prove that, and how Ray was, politically inclined and an activist. So my question is, I mean, even I'm fascinated by the difference or the limit which separates an artist from an activist. So would it be right to say, especially in this context, that the artist, that Ray, is an activist with certain with certain sensibilities, right? Or if I might use this term, I'm not sure if it rightly describes the concept. But can an artist be called an elite activist? And can an activist be called an uninspired artist? I mean, if you could throw some light on this.
Um, uh, Thank you for the question. I would say it's a wonderful question, and I mean it's a kind of a issue which would probably invite more discussion. But what I could say at this moment is that the role of an intellectual as activist and the role of activist as an individual, those need to be seen in relation to the society and the time. Maybe you probably have read the recent book by Abhijit Rai, Ajadi, which was released last year. In this book, Arundhati has a beautiful chapter, and Arundhati talks about the responsibility of intellectual, being a public intellectual herself. She says that it's the obligation of public intellectuals to see or to unveil the project of unseen which all fascist regimes try to do. So this is the responsibility of intellectuals. So intellectuals become activists in a way when he or she begins to unveil the fascist regime, and that provides, the way for, for dismantling the regime. Now, what does Udan Maharas do, in fact? Udan Maharas is not brainwashed. He escapes. He escapes Jantar Mantar, or when he's brought to, for brainwashing, he could barely manage to escape. But the fact is that before he disappears into jungle, what does he tell his students? He reminds them what he has taught them over years, and he asks them to be always vigilant. So this is something which an intellectual as an activist can do. So this is what perhaps summarizes Roy's attitude to politics, to activism. So this could be my answer at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. But I think we still need to, revisit this concept, because in the current times we see the failure of an intellectual or a public intellectual, where intellectualism has become a term of, associated with elitism, and it has
Yes.
become a word of criticism rather than, something to look up to, or I would say rather praise, as a word of praise. So I think the current times needs a more critical approach to this term and the functioning of the intellectual.
Yes, of course. What you have is obviously so. The point is that what should be the role of intellectual, as you have just
Yeah.
pointed out. That is, what should they
Yeah.
do? And in fact, Dr. Deep perhaps suggests that he or she should be like Udan Pandit. That is, you cannot just live
Right.
in a comfort zone. You cannot just
Right.
live in a comfort zone. You need to, you need to face things head on, and
Right.
that's, yeah, so that's what he suggests. But of course it is his way of telling, which is never loud, but it's subtle, it's nuanced. That's why Shakti is exceptional.
Thank
Right.
you. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
sir.
Thank you, sir.
There are comments, and there's one question from Professor Isra Jahan of Dhaka. The comments, so maybe you can go through the comments, and we can send them to you as well. But Isra Jahan would like you to throw some light on Ray's fascination for film adaptation of various literary texts, which is almost another paper. So, and we are running out of time. So, sir, maybe one point which you would suggest, which is your view of why Ray was so fascinated, or why he at all did this kind of an adaptation of literary works.
Yes, I mean, what I could say in brief is that Roy himself said that I am a storyteller. That is, I love to tell stories. And that's the reason he went for adapting literary text, because literary texts are good source of stories. So not only he adapted his own text, he also adapted, text by others, including his father and grandfather and others. So he was fascinated with text because those contain stories. You have stories there. So this could be my answer to Michelle Zaha's queries. And then
Um, I think if there are still questions, we have to take it at the end of the session too, because we are running a little late for that session. So we are going to postpone questions, if you still have it, after the second session. And I would call upon my joint convener, Dr. Rajabishi, to take up from here.
So welcome to the second and last session of today's webinar, Ray Across Borders, Music and Memory. I consider it a privilege for me to introduce Professor Abhijit Rai, who is known to many of us present here. I don't know, I personally know him since when? I can't even remember since my university days, which is, I have lost count of those years. So we are, so Abhijit, we are quite old, I guess. We are prehistoric in terms of age. So let me introduce Professor Abhijit Rai. Abhijit Rai is Professor, Department of Film Studies, and Director, School of Media, Communications and Culture, Jadavpur University, Kolkata. A member of the Editorial Board of Studies in South Asian Film and Media and Journal of Moving Image, Professor Rai writes extensively on television, media, and politics. He has received visiting fellowships from Maison de Sciences de l'Homme, which is the Center for Institute of Social Sciences in Paris, and Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Simla, University of Oregon, and Fujian Catholic University, Taiwan. Professor Rai has co-edited Channeling Cultures, Television Studies in India, and has written a book on the celebrated Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein. Professor Rai has been the creative consultant for KolkataWetlands.org and porosity.otherindias.com. He is currently associated with the DigiCamp Asia project, hosted by National University of Singapore. So over to you, Professor Rai, or Abhijit, as I call him.
Thank you, Rongili Di. It's a great privilege. Actually, I would say to be back at Barasat Government College. I mean, years back, I remember that I presented a paper at another international seminar, which was organized by Barasat Government College. Sati was there, many others were there. And of course, my association with Rongili Di goes a long way back. And I, in fact, feel a little awkward to be introduced in such a manner, in such formal manner, by Ronald D. But thanks really for all those generous words of appreciation and introduction. And thanks to the Cultural Committee of Barasat Government College for inviting me to speak at this seminar. Let me get to my presentation. I possibly would have to actually, cut short some of the sort of quotes, I mean, the passages that I have written. It's not a written paper as such. I have in front of me some notes from which I would call parts of and then talk about. The first thing that I want to make clear here is that I'm not going to talk about the virtuoso that Satyajit Rai was, his musical genius as such, because all of us know that, and there's no point underlining that time and again. And my approach would not be really to show you film clips after film clips and along with the music and then just point out that, look how great is this accompaniment, how great is the background music, or how great is this particular song that he put to tune or wrote. Because of course, I mean, one can go on and on and on and on, because he was indeed a genius. What I would try to do would introduce ourselves, and I'm sure that many of you know about what I'm going to talk about today. Many of the points that I would share are known to many of you. So would just give you a kind of a general sort of overview of Satyajit Rai's thoughts on music. And I would then try and relate that to his film practice. And of course, I would come up with my own commentary intermittently. So that is my approach in today's presentation. Just to give you an idea that Satyajit Rai's, Satyajit Rai's Opus trilogy and Parashpathur, for these two, 4 films, music director was Ravi Shankar, and for Jalshakar it was Ustad Vilayat Khan. Ustad Ali Akbar Khan composed music for Devi, which is 1960 from 1955 to 60. And music of Rabindranath Tagore was composed by Jyotirindranath Mehta. And since Teen Kunna, I'm telling you all this so that you have a clear picture of the enormity of the oeuvre of music that Satyajit Ray composed. Since Teen Kunna, 1961, which was Tagore's centenary year, since Teen Kunna 1961, Ray himself began composing music for his own films. And he also directed music for Shakespeare Walla, which is directed by James Ivory, and it's made in English in 1965. House That Never Dies, directed by Tony Mayer, 1969. Bakshu Bodol by Nityananda Dattu, 1970. Potik Chach by 1983. Gupi Baga Phire Elo, once again Shondip by 1991. And he also directed music for the 2 seasons of the television series Satyajit Ray Presents, that is from 1985 to 1987. So one can imagine, he composed for 29 of his own films, 5 of others, and 2 seasons of a TV series, and wrote lyrics for a large number of songs. And compared to the enormity and richness of this truly awe-inspiring musical oeuvre, little work has been done on Ray's music, its quality or otherwise. Of course, one remembers a milestone book by Sudhir Chakraborty, whose affection I had the privilege of having in so many informal art does, but also formally. We also got him as a teacher. He taught us in Dalit University's film studies class Satyajit Ray's music. So he wrote this book, Bangla Filmer Gan in Satyajit Ray. It was published by Ganji in 2008. And in fact, much of my interest in Ray's music was actually triggered by Sudhir Babu's inputs, essays, and does broadly music. So, let me acknowledge the date that I have to this wonderful person.
Excuse me, Abhijit. Your voice is fading in and fading out. Just if you can adjust a bit. We are missing parts of your talk.
Okay.
Sorry.
Shall I be a little louder?
Yeah, maybe. And there is a slight echo, and some words we are missing out on some words.
Let us see whether it improves.
For this interjection. Sorry.
If I have a headphone, no, it's all right. If I have a headphone and if I speak to the mic, whether the sound becomes a little, is it better now, or is it the same?
Yeah, it seems a little better, but just continue, please. We'll see.
Yeah. Please tell me if once again such a problem pops up. Okay. 2 reasons Satyajit Ray cites for starting to compose music for his own films, and as I told you that in the initial years until 1961, he was not composing. Until 1960, he was not composing films for his own, composing music for his own films. 2 reasons Satyajit Ray cites for starting to compose music for his own films. One was that none of the musicians he worked with in his early films had any experience of composing for film or theatre, and this is what he actually tells us in one of his interviews, barring, of course, Ravi Shankar, who had scored for ballets and theatres. So they were to be, painstakingly briefed about the musical demand of a scene, and were asked to create a number of pieces for a single scene. But when he says that when it actually came to laying down the tracks, I found I was always a little too short of music, and I needed more. And since a busy concert performer, music directors were not always readily available, Ray's cameraman, and this is something that we don't know of, many of us, Subrata Mitro, which according to Ray was a gifted sitarist, had to pitch in occasionally. And the most accompanying, for instance, the music accompanying, the confectioner, Chinibash Kaka in Pothir Pachali, is walking, was played by him and not Ravi Shankar. And so there are a number of such instances. And secondly, Ray was starting to get too many musical ideas of his own while working with other composers. And here he actually sort of tweaks the music of the composers a number of times. He's actually getting options from them, 2 or 3 of short pieces of music, and while he's actually going to the editing table and trying to add music to the visual track, what he's doing is it's constantly changing. He's slowing down, he's lengthening, he's cutting it into pieces, and he's adding music from Western classical composers. So he says that, and sometimes he's actually playing backwards some of the Western classical pieces, and then kind of combining with the music that he had, say, from Vilayat Khan. This is something that happened in Jalshaghar, for instance. This is the famous scene from Jalshaghar when the lights go off one by one, and Jomidar Vishwambhar Rai moves around, stroke, an expression of imminent doom. Ray combines Ustad Vilayat Khan's music with a backwardly played piece by the Finnish composer John Sibelius, and he said that he needed another kind of texture in the music which was not there. So he was deploying Subrata Mitra's music, he was getting others' music, he was playing them backwards, combining, he was slowing down, he was lengthening, he was doing all kinds of things with the music directors with whom he actually worked in his early years. So let us very quickly listen to, or actually watch, this particular scene, and where he's playing Sibelius backwards, and then of course followed by violin that comes in. But within that Western piece of music, there is maybe at a very lower volume, there is also Vilayat Khan's sitar. So let us watch that. I'll just please give me a moment. I'll share the screen and um, can you see it now?
Yes, that's fine.
Yes.
Visible?
Yeah. You want to make it full screen? No.
I just I think it's being presented. Let us see what's happening here.
Okay.
It's showing presentation audio, but I don't think the video is playing. This is what I apprehended. So you have the video.
Still.
On your end, play the video, please.
Would you like me to do it?
Yes, please.
Yeah. In that case, you just have to stop.
I'm stopping. I'm stopping it. Yes. I think this is how you would proceed. I think none of the tweets that I have would work. So let us let it work from your side.
This is the one.
We can't see anything.
We are not able to see it. Yeah, I think it has come. It has come. Can you make it full screen or something? The audio is not, the sound, music is not audible. This is the scene, of course, and we can faintly see it. No, I don't think the audio is working. So I think let us forget it, and I'll just keep referring.
Just 1 second. Just let us try once. Just once
Yeah.
again.
Yeah.
Antara, can you hear me?
হ্যাঁ শুনতে পাচ্ছি
তুমি একটু দেখো তো অডিওটা একটু চেক করো একবার আর ফুল স্ক্রিন না হলেও হবে হলে তো ভালোই হয়
দেখছি
অডিওটাই আসলে দরকার just make sure that your audio of both the computer and the YouTube both of them are on and are in full volume. Yes. Can't see it, but anyway. No.
In 1956,
This is not
the
the
children
music.
at the festival sat down to watch this film. It was made in Bengal, and it was completely unlike any other Indian cinema they had seen.
No. This is not the video. This is not the link. I think you've gone to the next video. Anyway, I think let us not waste time.
He was a 35-year-old graphic designer in an advertising agency in Kolkata.
অন্তরা এটা নয় এটা নয়
The one
Also, we
which is
cannot see it.
written on it. That is the one.
কোনটা আরেকবার একটু বলো
সত্যজিৎ রায় লেখা উপরে আছে
I sent you the link, and you just click the link, and then just take it to the point. Yeah, the first one. The first one, yes. The first one. Click it. First one. Click it.
জলসাঘর
Yes. Yes.
The director has won international acclaim.
Yes.
In
This
most
is
of
the
India,
one. Take it to whatever. 7 minutes 35 seconds or something.
অন্তরা আগে ইউটিউবটা বন্ধ করো else we can't hear this one.
Language, you see, you can see, you can show my films only in West Bengal and some of the big cities like Madras, Delhi, and Bombay with English subtitles. So the influence has not been very wide.
Some other video is running. That's the problem. There is some other video that is running along with this.
Now, thanks to the Film Society movement,
Or is it somebody else playing another video?
in our other provinces as well.
no
But formerly, for a long time, I was just a name.
you want to
No,
close
I think the point is made. Let us forget it. Okay.
Okay.
The point is made. Okay. I mean, this is in fact not. I mean, this is just to jazz up the presentation. I mean, of course. I mean, you can always go back to and just watch it. That's not a problem. I mean, this is just to make this point how, about innovations and creativity. What he was trying to do is to get a texture that was missing. He always thought he was always very unhappy about, working with other composers. So, I mean, not entirely, of course. I mean, most of the time he was happy, but I mean, there was always this tinge of unhappiness about, the lack, a feeling of lack that he had. So he had to constantly. Yes, so I think we should stop presenting, and so he had to constantly innovate. So playing Sibelius backwards is one of the instances of such very weird but really productive and very creative innovation. Anyway, so Okay, so so I will just scrap. Maybe I have towards the end of it, I have just two pictures to show, two screens which are like still pictures. So I think those would be visible. Shouldn't be a problem. But see film clips that I had in mind, I'm just scrapping. Save us some time, but I'll just describe the scenes. Anyway, so of course the first was the problem that he had. The second was that he was getting his own musical ideas, a lot of them. Anyway, um, the confidence and ease with which he quickly came to grips with music making himself had to do with his background of music and not so much of formal training, I would say, but of listening. His taste of culture in general, including, of course, music, was, and this is a famous saying of his, he's been saying this in many of his interviews shaped shaped in equal measure by the East and the West. প্রাচ্য এবং পাশ্চাত্য দুদিক থেকেই দুটোর দ্বারাই সমানভাবে নির্মিত। So in fact, actually, this actually brings us to a certain point. Innovation is something which I've mentioned in my title. Henceforth, what I'm going to focus on is this whole question of eclecticism, and then I'm going to relate this to the questions of modernity. And this eclecticism, to draw from various sources and to sort of break this whole barrier of the East and the West. And of course, it's not being done single-handedly by him. And before that, there are more than 100 years of tradition of that. The 19th century is the epitome of that. Modern sensibility is so much of exchange. Um, and you cannot imagine the colonial subject, also the post-colonial subject, without such a melange of the East and the West. Anyway, so if you think of his background, but I'm not quite fond of biographical reading, but I think that this is a kind of presentation. It's not a formal paper that I'm presenting, in which I can share some of the interesting facts about his own, about his upbringing. You know, of course, I mean, one can look at Upendra Krishna Rai Choudhury, his grandfather was a pioneer of Indian printing, and himself used to play bakhwaj and violin. And Satyajit Rai was privy to the Brahmo Samaj songs. He talks about the some sensibility of reform that was there in Brahmo Samaj itself. It's not that the songs used to always attract him as much, but anyway. And of course, I mean, what I suppose also is to be historically put into some kind of context is this whole is rhythm and tempo in the verse that comes from Sukumar Rai, for instance. So, in fact, if you look at eclecticism in terms of and rather playfully, one possibly remembers that in 1914, when Abul Tabul was published, the first, and when Upendra Kishore was actually when he started Shandesh and he was editing, and in this whole Abul Tabul series, the first poetry was Khichuri, where combinations itself becomes some kind of a very creative, playful kind of an exercise. And of course, I mean, one possibly can from here actually go to Satyajit Rai's fiction and look at many such characters to a certain extent. But anyway, but of course, in Sukumar Rai, you have Hajaru, Wakachap, Morguru, Girgitia, Shinhurin, Hatimi, and all kinds of things, So, constant combining of unimaginable things, which you would not quote unquote naturally do or generally do, is something which almost emerged as a kind of a challenge. He would leave no stone unturned in order to get what possibly Ray was referring to as a right kind of texture. and on many occasions he was actually using unusual sound producers like the crockery, the cups and teapots and metals and little hammers and things like that. So not always he was using formal instruments. And many of and this is one side of him which has not been discussed much. And Satyajit Ray himself had discovered, he talks about a record of Beethoven he discovered in his high school days. And he was so engrossed in Beethoven that he started buying scores a little later, of course. And when in his early 20s, this is rather fascinating and very curious for us to know that he would be able to read scores and would be able to memorize and would be able to remember the music. It's almost like when when somebody listening to music and constantly and being able to visualize the scores and reading the scores, and the music would the music would play in the brain, in something, would play in the mind, for instance. So this is a tremendous kind of capability that he grew. And there is this whole lore about, and this myth about, that he was only he had a master craftsmanship, and he had mastery over Western classical music only. No, because in one of his interviews, and that's the interview to Sham Benegal, I remember that he says that in Calcutta, when he has to work with musicians here, he has to provide the notations according to Hindustan classical music method. So he was pretty aware of that, and he knew it, and so he would write the Sharolipi in that way. But whoever understands the Western stab method, notations in Western style, he would do. That person coming possibly from Calcutta School of Music and a Western music trainer, he would do that for that person in that manner as well. So he was almost equally, not only conversant, but sort of expert. He had that kind of an expertise over both kinds of scoring. Of course, listening was something which is, he in fact says that I had a phenomenal musical memory. And he was, and one particular period that commentators have referred to, which has been a very rich period for him, both in terms of film watching and in terms of music listening, is during the World War. That's the 1940s, 45, 46, and down to the 50s. And he got interested in all kinds of music, including jazz, and he used to, of course, visit Indian classical music concerts as well. Um, uh, Whoever came to Calcutta or sometimes in Bombay or any other city in India, visiting musicians like Isaac Stern, the violinist, he would try and attend those programs. On the BBC World Service, he listened to Narayana Menon, in London, playing chess, Johann Sebastian Bach on the Veena, and on Berlin radio, some good classical music broadcast along with Hitler's speeches, possibly Wagner. There's no reference, but possibly could be Wagner. And in Bombay, where he had relatives, and of course at that point of time his cousin Vijaya was living there, and he discovered a source of miniature scores of Western classical music and began buying them and reading them in bed. Anyway, so I mean, one can go on and on about his musical background. And he became an avid buyer of 78 RPM records. At one point of time, there's a very interesting kind of an anecdote. At one point of time, he was looking for a house in Calcutta along with his mother. And in one of the letters to Alex Aronson, to whom Professor Asanusaman was referring, he said that I propose to have a room of my own, which should be a library come studio come concert room affair. So he wants that kind of room. Anyway, so he was shaped in equal measure by the East and the West, and he says that he has always mixed European and says that our Oriental music. He says that because this is very important for us to remember that it doesn't only come from simply the ability to mix or a kind of an abstract feeling that it would sound good, but it actually comes from his idea of his, and this is very important, his idea of the audience, which he thinks is his audience. This is, as the popular parlance goes, the target audience, which is the urban, educated, middle class, and does not necessarily mean that he would have cerebral investment into understanding films, and he would not be fond of that. I mean, he would always be sort of inclining towards the common minimum denominator. For him, comprehensibility, understanding is very important. He would not want to make films which would be very difficult. He would make it very explicit that I want a wider audience. I want a wider audience. So about this point of comprehensibility, I would come later in this presentation. So he says that because our lifestyle is a mixture anyway, and I quote, a mixture anyway. We live in houses which have a European look, full of English books. When we go out to work, we wear European dress. It no longer retains its Indian purity, thanks to the colonial rule or whatever. It's a mixture now. So if you use purely classical Indian music in films, for instance, which are contemporary in theme and look urban, if you use classical music, it's Indian music, it's wrong. It doesn't sound right. So he says, I generally combine, I have almost combined Western Indian styles, except when I go back in time to earlier periods. Of course, I mean, there are period films like Shatranj Ka Khiladi, of course, where we cannot combine much because it thinks that kind of a uh, certain kind of a sensibility. The aura of the period could only be caught through a certain kind of music. But of course, I mean, Wajid Ali Khan is um, very much, it's part of a very, on the later, very, very late period where the Mughal Empire is almost gone. So it didn't have to be completely, invested into, Hindustani classical music. But anyway, so I have almost combined Western Indian styles, except when I go back in time to earlier periods when life was. Now here's this peculiar idea of when life was purer. One actually doubts whether life was ever purer, whether there was ever a pristine kind of a world. But anyway, life was purer from the visual aspect, which is less influenced by the West. So anyway, relatively purer. And or it is a story about village or rural India. So he thinks that those could be situations and contexts where he would use it he could use Indian classical music um, more than other kinds of contexts, more urbane kind of context. So he says that especially for my contemporary films, I knew that raga music alone just would not do, because the average, and this is his audience, he says the average educated middle class Bengali may not be a sahib, but his consciousness is cosmopolitan. So he's talking about this whole consciousness, whatever, sensibility. I think taste, ruchi, it is influenced by Western modes, whatever. So mixing and combining, and in fact, what I had in mind was another instance from Shakespeare Walla. This is not his own film. He was composing music for James Ivory and Ismail Merchant's film. And the theme music is also another very unique sort of contribution of Satyajit Rai to Indian cinema. This the idea of theme music is not in vogue in Indian cinema before him. So in almost all of his films, you find a theme music, right from the beginning from Pother Rajni. Anyway, so for Shakespeare, Walla, the theme music that he composed, and James Ivory tells us that it's the theme music sounds very Western, but it's actually Indian raga. It's Imon raga. In fact, Aloknath De, who's this legendary music arranger who authored sort of in his films, he said that what Shotutra would always do is that you pick up a raga and would make it sound, very, very Western at times, at least, and for what reason it becomes something like that, nobody knows. But he would, and he says that উনি চলনটা বদলে দেবেন, সময়ের সঙ্গে যে সম্পর্ক সেটা বদলে দেবেন, তালের বাইরে বাইরে ফেলে হোক, টেনে দিয়ে হোক, হঠাৎ করে নানা রকম elongated straight line তৈরি করে হোক. What I have my personal feeling, is that Indian classical music is enriched by this idea of the wave, like the mir, and something that in Satyajit Rai's music you won't find much. You would find graphical straight lines. There are joints from one to the other. It would go. Um, you know, Somewhat a dominance of that. I'm not saying that there are. It's absent. It's not like that. So that would bring this whole, a kind of a tenor of the Western classical, uh, and parallelisms of sorts, polyphony, things like that. So polyphony is one thing, which creates an air of a concerto, for instance. And anyway, so many of these things which sounds like absolutely own original composition and possibly drawn from a Western classical composer are actually based on ragas. Anyway, so we are not, and there are many other instances when the soldiers actually march for the war in Gupiga in Bagaline, for instance. You hear an extended drum roll, Baga's Dhol, which is very martial in character. Which is this song, Ore Baba Dekho Che Koto Sena Choleche Shahare. So it's like it fuses the tremolo of the violins, and it's like the ostinato, like bass with the sarod and the bamboo flute. So what is the combination? Anyway, I mean, of course, this is acknowledged in Ghore Baire like no other text. For instance, where being modern is actually inserted into the text. Being modern is actually learning piano, where the zamindar's wife is actually learning piano from European music teacher, and the husband, of course, with the expectation of a companionate wife, which becomes playing with fire, and which becomes a very different kind of a tale. Turns out to be a different kind of a tale. But anyway, he repeatedly checks, just asks that how much is the improvement, how is she doing. So to be educated is to read natok and novel and to learn piano, that kind of thing. This is what Satyajit Rai feels, and so and to be educated in a certain direction. Of course, I'm sure that he had other notions of pedagogy and education. But at least, and this is the field in which you would feel comfortable, and this you would think that this is my milieu, and I'm able to talk about this than any other milieu. So this eclecticism, modernity, drawing from various sources, and we don't have much time to talk about Rabindra Songit, but he had very strong views about Rabindra Songit. One particular essay which I would ask everybody to read is Rabindra Songit Niye Bhabbar Kotha. This essay is freely available online, and he is all praise for Tagore because Tagore is eclectic. He says that Dhrupad, and he says that বঙ্কিমের উপন্যাস রচনার মতোই রবীন্দ্রনাথের গীত রচনার ধারণাটা আসলে ইউরোপীয়. And all of us know that this, about this Tagore's unique innovation of the চার তুকের গান, স্থায়ী অন্তরা অস্থায়ী অন্তরা. It's kind of a, it's not a quoted, but still, that kind of a structure, kind of a song, which you would not find before him. and রেস সত্যজিৎ রায় says ধ্রুপদ, খেয়াল, ঠুংরি, টপ্পা, কীর্তন, লোকসঙ্গীতের প্রত্যেকটি রবীন্দ্রনাথকে কম বেশি প্রভাবিত করেছিল এবং সবকটির স্পষ্ট আভাস রবীন্দ্রসঙ্গীতে পাওয়া যায়। এছাড়া কিছু বিদেশি, কিছু কর্ণাটকী আর ভারতবর্ষের অন্যান্য প্রদেশের কিছু গানের প্রতিরূপও তার গানে দেখি। And in Satyajit Rai also you see music from old Bengali style, for which he actually wrote a song, Jiriyakhana. So you can say it's Purono Bangla Adhunik Akashbanir Gan style. Nepali song, the Nepali kind of the Nepali folk kind of music that he uses, both in Kanchenjunga and in the documentary Sikkim, and of course, I mean, Western classical music, Indian classical music, Bangla Lokogan, and you say almost any kind of genre that one would be exposed to. You cannot expect. I'm not saying you cannot expect, but he was not privy to at least all kinds of music from all over the world. Of course, you don't find Chinese music. But anyway, um, so talking about eclecticism, modernity, and he says that um, the challenge is to Indianize, the challenge is to indigenize, so that it does not have that trace of that Western. That you are doing translation, it should not have that kind of trace. It should sound local. It should have the sense of, it should carry the sense of coming out from this particular land. Says that রবীন্দ্রনাথের ক্ষেত্রে সেগুলিকে অনুকরণ না বলে নবীকরণ বলা যেতে পারে, renewal, injecting a new lease of life. বাংলা তথা ভারতীয় গানের এই নবীকৃত রূপই হলো রবীন্দ্রসঙ্গীত। And he says, and something therefore he identifies with the project of Tagore, I would say. It's not Rabindrasangit per se. It says রবীন্দ্রনাথের গান হচ্ছে একান্ত নিজস্ব একটি বিশেষ শ্রেণীর বাঙালিয়ানার সাংগীতিক প্রকাশ। So of course his film would be something like বিশেষ শ্রেণীর বাঙালিয়ানার চলচ্চিত্রীয় প্রকাশ, and he makes it very clear. He doesn't shy away from saying that. রবীন্দ্রনাথের রুচি, তার সংস্কার, তার পরিবেশ, শিক্ষা, দীক্ষা, শিল্পবোধ, সাহিত্যবোধ, অর্থাৎ তার পুরো চরিত্রটাই এই গানে প্রতিফলিত। He of course say that it is the songs of Tagore that has evolved less than any other genre you can think of that Tagore engages with creatively. Novel, short story, essay. He saying that structurally all of them have evolved. The songs have not evolved much because there is so much of an overarching structure that guides. Anyway, so I just thought that I should at least tangentially refer to Tagore's idea of Satyajit Ray's idea, sort of perspectives and views, because it shades light on his own creative practice. He has very interesting ideas about accompaniment, for instance. I mean, he says that accompaniment is something that he resents, he does not like, especially percussion accompaniment. He says that even if you want to accompany, ideally it's no accompaniment, but if you want accompaniment, you can have a musical instrument which would keep the rhythm, something like piano, which is an accompaniment, but the strumming of the piano is something which keeps the rhythm, that kind of thing. So you don't need the percussion, in fact, but at the same time he's asking, well, কীর্তনাঙ্গের গানে খোল বাজাচ্ছ, এটা চলবে না। বলছেন কীর্তন জাতের গানে সরাসরি খোল করতাল চলবে না, কিন্তু তার ছোঁয়া থাকতে পারে, কারণ সে গান আসলে কীর্তন নয়, কীর্তনের ছায়া। রবীন্দ্রসঙ্গীত তাকে কীর্তন করে তুলো না, কারণ সেটা কীর্তন, এটা ওর মত। এটাকে মজা করে বলছেন, যন্ত্রের ব্যাপারে দিশিবিলিতি বাজবিচার না থাকাই ভালো, তবে হাওয়াইয়ান গিটার হারমোনিয়ামের চেয়ে অনেক গুণে বেশি অসহ্য। ওটা দূর না করা অবধি নিশ্চিন্তি। Anyway, so and why he does not like তবলা, because he says that তবলার সঙ্গতে ওস্তাদি মেজাজটা বড় চট করে এসে পড়ে, ওটা ব্যবহার করতে হলে তান বিস্তারের রাস্তাও খুলে দিতে হয়, কাজেই ওটার বদলে যন্ত্রকেই তালের কাজে লাগানো উচিত। Basically what he thinks about Tagore is that Tagore has come with a certain kind of enrichment, a certain kind of an engagement, certain kind of dialogue, certain kind of an enrichment of a culture of the melange, culture of combination, and has, if not completely resolved, but has addressed quite successfully this challenge of combination, where the air of the air of in, where the effort of indigenization is successful, and it sounds and it is able to create a musical genre by itself. So he wants to, he does not use the word purity, but he says that um, uh, he seems to be inclined towards maintaining that to a large extent, but he's not inhibited. He's saying that, of course, I mean, you can go for accompaniment, doesn't have so much of reservation as to sort of foreclose creativity. But anyway, so what we actually find in Tagore's musical project is definitely a modern project. Um, you know, as I was referring to, this very idea of the theme music. And when I say modern, there is a fixation with unity. There is no doubt about it. When he was asked that why theme music? Why do you think that there has to be always a theme? And theme music is not only a kind of a theme music which kind of tries to catch the theme of the film. Many a time it's seen that certain themes are associated with particular characters. Also, I'll come to this particular point a little shortly, where we talk about how Satyajit Rai also conceives the film form as a musical form. So anyway, so this question of modernity, he thinks that theme music, which kind of almost as an overture, it's like comes back and back on, and says that the modern or introduces, let's say, doesn't always come back, but it introduces the whole context. And he says that it brings in a certain value, certain unity to the film. Of course, I'm sure that when we say modern, we talk about values of realism, continuity, closure, or broadly science, rationality, logic. So in film practice, is drawing from even in film practice, and this is something that we are not concerned with in today's discussion. But even in film practice, I was talking about music, but in film practice also he's drawing from various sources. His whole taste is created out of them. As to film form, the Italian neorealism, the Indian novelistic mode of address, and of course, it has its horizon. I'm not saying that one can be exhaustive. But anyway, I said that he uses Ramprasadi Gan, old Bengali songs, Bengali folk songs, Nepali folk songs, Rajasthani songs, Raja Ramohn Rai's Gan, Rabindrasangit, of course, Western classical. Anyway, one could go on giving examples on examples, but there is a kind of a generic mixtures. Kotoi Rango Dekhi Duniyai, which is a lokogan, and it has a particular structure. And Rag Shungiter Nishchi Utshu, the source, possibly can be found in indigenous, the long traditions, long musical traditions. নিশ্চয়ই লোক ঐতিহ্যের মধ্যেই আছে, তার বাইরে হতে পারে না। For some reason, Satyajit Rai composed this song with insistently and making it a point that it should adhere to a particular rag. So Kotoi Rango Dekhi Duniya is Kafi rag, and Dekho Re Nayan Mele Bhoirobi, Paye Pori Bag Mama Puriya Dhanesri. So they don't sound apparent. Payapuri Bhagwam, of course, sounds very Indian classical. There is no doubt about it. For me, it's one of the fantastic song compositions I've ever come across in my life. Anyway, so generic mixtures. Um, One particular point of, I wouldn't say caution, but just in passing, that there is an increasing, there is a rising discourse, especially from the late 1990s and what Rajabishi Rai's skepticism towards the model, especially towards the later career, starting from particularly the urban trilogy of the 1970s, you know, where very interesting things are happening. I would say what's happening in the field of music. But before that, he, it seems, at least at the level of content, theme, narrative, characterization, losing faith on the urban, educated middle class, losing faith in generally a kind of society or world, um, you know, which could be enriching in terms of culture, in terms of um, you know the gains, the many the many achievements of quote unquote the Bhadralok, the many achievements of the urban educated middle class, the many achievements of 19th century modernity, and these modernities in crisis. And especially, and this is something that I cannot discuss in such a short premise, in his film form also we see such kinds of change in structure, where the modern form, which have a loaded values of realism, continuity, and closure, faces a crisis in the 1970s. It's reflected in the form, it's reflected in the content, in terms of character treatment, storytelling, everywhere. But what happens in case of music, and this is another clip that I wanted you to see. So if you are provoked enough, you can just go back and watch that clip. The opening scene of John Warren. See that there is no music, and unlike the films that Satyajit had made till then, it's so what is happening increasingly coming into Ray's films is that more and more ambient sound as is moving through the 60s and down into the 70s. You know, more and more ambient sound. Music is there, but not as much as it used to be in earlier films. In the first scene, you would see that it's an examination hall, and it's pin drop silence. But then, of course, I mean, people at times, the students, the examinees, they're trying to talk to each other at times, and you see Shotter Doshok, Mukti Doshok Lekha at the back of the invigilator, and they are exchanging cheats, and somebody's entering and giving the, all the answers. So this like open book writing, that kind of thing. And music comes a little later, only when there's an exploration of psychological interiority, where where somebody's story starts, not before that. A lot of city streets, ambient sound, and things like that. Uh, so you could see that from one's perspective, so Satyajit Ray maintained that. This is very important for us to remember. This is something I want to underline here, is that he said he believed that music is extraneous to film. Music is not an indispensable part. Is not indispensable. It is dispensable. One can simply do away with music. But then why one would need music? Especially in the interview that he gave after making Devi. But here's something that he constantly maintained, at least until the 80s. It is traceable. He believed that the audience didn't have that kind of an intelligibility. So if I want to underline a particular mood, and I think that the audience would not gauge that, so I want to add music. Otherwise, ideally, I would not want music here. So he thinks that music is something which, in fact, might actually destroy the film if not properly used. And best is not to use any music, but you would have to use it. Almost it gives you an impression that you would use it under compulsion. Anyway, so maybe towards the end of it, through the urban trilogy, you get the sense that his films are becoming more modern. Modern in the sense of, as Chris Jenks says, that modernity is ocular centric. Modernity is visual. Visual in the sense of seeing is believing. Visual in the sense that, um, you know, um, visual as in evidence, visual as in beauty. There is this whole hierarchy. Well, this whole hierarchy, visual, is taken to be occupying the highest position in the hierarchy of the senses, as Marx said, that the senses too have their history. সবার উপরে হচ্ছে দৃশ্য, তারপর শব্দ, এরকম। এটা আমি অন্যত্র লিখেছি যে if you listen to a song like Aji Bijano Ghare, if you go back and listen to the song once again and pay particular attention to the lyrics, and this is something that to which to which my teacher and Shivaji Bandyopadhyay once referred to, and then I listened to that carefully, and I discovered that yes, that song is about touch, and it questions dominance of the visual, something that 19th century modernity advocates. সর্বত্র দৃশ্যের dominance. Satyajit, of course, always believed the film is basically a visual medium, and for him, sound, of course, would add to a realism which is premised primarily upon the visual, and so music is extraneous to film, so anyway, so Aji Bijano Ghare is just in passing, আধার থাকুক দিকে দিকে তোমার পরশ খানি থা. So it's all about touch, where constantly the lovers are looking at each other and falling in love. That kind of relationship, which has been celebrated generally by aesthetics all over the world, especially post-late 18th century, is something which or questions. The point is I'm trying to make here is that this whole questioning, interrogation of the modern is something which actually crops out of the modern. The condition or possibility of questioning the modern is the modern. It's something that one has to keep in mind, something that Tagore had, and that kind of a skepticism Satyajit Rai also had. But what is happening was a kind of a double age that we can witness here, is that, in a way, these films, which would have lesser music now, you could see that they are becoming more modern because they are more invested into the visual, right? And he would almost presume that possibly Satyajit Rai now understands that now my audience is more film literate, possibly, so I can risk not using music, and they can get the mood, as it were. So on one hand, you can have that kind of a sense that there is less and less, music. But on the other hand, you would see that at the level of thematic treatment, so it's visually rich and visually invested, so modern. But when it comes to treatment of characters, when it comes to narrative, characterization, it's sort of distrust. Not so much, but there is some bit of skepticism about the modern values. I thought that this is something which is interesting to note, so I just shared that point. Now let us come to the musical form. I don't know how much time I have. It's already 9:06, possibly another 5 minutes or 10 minutes, maybe.
Yes. Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Now, the first thing that Satyajit Rai says about film in general as an apparatus, of subject formation, as, if you like, medium, as, let's say, an art form, he refers to some kind of a, I won't say analogy, though he says analogy, but I think which is something like what Raymond Williams calls homology, possibly a kind of a structural correspondence with music. And it says that এই দুটোই সময়বদ্ধ শিল্প. Both of these are art forms which are time bound. They start at a certain time and they end at a certain time. Unlike sculpture, unlike painting, unlike also even literature, from which you are free to withdraw at some point of time and then come back. And he says that film exists in time and music exists in time. You know, but then I mean, he asks himself, his mode of writing is very self-annihilating. It's very interesting. He creates a problem for himself, addresses that, and then once again he tries to cut that down and undermine that, and gives an answer to that. So that way he progresses. Says that what happens to, I mean, is it like any music? He says no. Indian classical music, he believes, for at least his kind of film, or also generally film, could not actually lend that kind of a formal correspondence, could not lend that kind of a form, because that does not exist in time, in the sense that it is improvisational. This whole structure of alap, case of music, of course, in case of instrumental music, alap, jod, and jhala, in case of folk music, uh, starts at a very starts slowly. The tempo is low, and then it speeds up and speeds up, and on and on and on and on. And in his own language, Satyajit says that it then kind of, it's very interestingly, he refers to temple. He says that it's like a temple where the speed goes up and up and up and it reaches a kind of a crescendo where it's a tremendous speed, and there's a kind of an ultimate resolution. So he says that that's the structure of the temple, maybe. But one can sing for 20 minutes, 5 minutes, 45 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hours, 5 hours. It can go on and on and on and on. Satyajit Rai, as largely a modern craftsperson or composer, would be more inclined towards, um, time-bound expositions where everything is planned and where everything is guarded. So for him, film, he thinks, would be more close to the Western classical music, in which one can talk about compositions, and then compositions are executed. And he thinks that in case of raga music, and of course he's tremendously fond of, and he uses it, and he has kind of a prodigal knowledge of that. There's no doubt about it. But he would not say that can lend a certain degree of, structural response. That is not a way I can structure a film. Film structuration has to be. It doesn't have to be. One may not keep that in mind consciously. He experimented with that, and this is something that's very, very important for us to remember when we talk about music. That kind of eclecticism, modernity, and its adherence to and combination adherence to Western classical music, the legacy of that, something which also seeps into the form. And it says that that kind of improvisation in Indian classical music is not something which is possible to be imbricated into the form of the film. Western classical music, of course, one can do it. And he experimented with that. In case of, and there are, of course, various other reasons that he gives. He talks about the dramatic structure of the Western music. He talks about Muder Othanama. সেটা মনে হয়েছিল যে ইন্ডিয়ান ক্লাসিক্যাল মিউজিকের ক্ষেত্রে একটা গতি আছে, একটা স্ট্রাকচার দেওয়া থাকে, রাগ, এটা কোটি কোটি লোক কোটি কোটি বার পারফর্ম করলে কোটি কোটি রকমের পারফরমেন্স হবে, একটা কোনো গিভেন কম্পোজিশন, হাজার রকমের কম্পোজিশন তৈরি করা যায়, হাজার রকমের ফিল্মের মতো। So it's not time bound. That's Indian classical music. Where and the structure of Indian classical music, he thinks, is not dramatic; it is ornament. অলংকারের উপর অলংকার, রস সৃষ্টির ব্যাপার আছে, এবং সেটা কোথাও একটা একমুখী হয়ে কোনো এক জায়গায় তার একটা নিষ্পত্তি হচ্ছে। Um, um, but of course, he refers to various other kinds of Western compositions which are very dramatic, which at times also give you a sense of non-resolution. You'll be not fond of them, but still dramatizations of various kinds, which don't move towards one pre-given kind of a diktat as such. Anyway, so he talks about humanism of the sonata form, by way of which it refers to particular characters carrying with them particular musical themes. Anyway, so Kanchanjunga is one film that sometimes, I'll just finish this point in just 1 minute. Sometimes he says, one can actually go into reading the film against the grain, just try to read the film deeply and try to understand how is it like that. And that could be another discussion, not today. In the form of the Western rondo, the rondo is, they are basically, they conform to two kinds of basic structures. So one is the 5-part, which is called the abaka, and the other is the 7-part, abakaba. So Kanchanjunga, he says he tried to build it along the structure of the rondo. One can try and find out the 5-part and 7-part thing, the kind of dramatic conflicts, one developing from the other. And Charulata, which his favorite film, something that he mentions almost everywhere, it's pretty common to the way he made music of Charulata as well. He refers to this is something that he actually shared with Adi Gwazdar, the famous pianist, friend of Satyajit Rai in Kolkata. I had a great privilege of doing this 2-year course in National Bhavan, and two of the persons who used to give us musical lessons, play music and talk about them, was Adi Gwazdar and Kishore Chatterjee. And this is something that Adi Gwazdar reminisces and said that Satyajit Rai shared with him, something that is also mentioned in Shri Chakraborty's book, is that Ray referred to Charulata as a string quintet, this whole film, where Charu is the first violin, Amol is the second violin, Bhupati as the cello, and 3 dominant characters, and Umapadu and Mandakini, the 2 violas, So if we actually go back to watch Charulata from this kind of perspective, we'll see that, how the structure of the quintet, if we are conversant about that, possibly a very different order of pleasure would emerge from Charulata, And anyway, so, and of course, Feluda is one character, associated with who would be themes. You would love to associate various kinds of themes with Feluda in different films. Basically, and I would be very, very sketchy from here onwards, though I possibly, had I had time, I could have gone deeper into theorization of it. Basically, this whole idea of the musical form film comes from a certain understanding that form works subliminally in the mind of the spectator. So I'm watching a film, I'm engrossed in the story, I constantly talk about the content, the characters, the relationships, the love and the hate and all kinds of things. But something that I may not realize, but something which might actually produce in me, feelings which are in the domain of psychology, of course, have to do with form, and somebody from a completely different, opposite, possibly, side of the film film creativity spectrum, Sergei Eisenstein, would always have that kind of belief that the form is something which creates, which works subliminally in your mind. It's not a story, it's not a narrative all the time. So he would always be talking about, this whole idea of the montage, the idea of the conflict between the shots, etc. And broadly, and this is something I'm just referring tangentially, because this aspect is something that have started to explore, being inspired by a presentation that Pinaki made in Centenary seminar that we organized in our department. He was speaking on Ray's illustrations, Ray as a designer, right? And he was talking about the Gestalt theory of the 1920s and 30s, particularly emanating from Germany. Gestalt, designers and art practitioners believed that certain kinds of shapes and sizes and directionality and line drawings would create certain kinds of feelings in you. It doesn't have to do with characters, talking, society, relationships, whatever, just shapes and size and lines and dots and such things, And Satyajit's connection with Gestalt, it's completely another story. That Gestalt, at that point in time in the 1930s, Gestalt was also criticized as something which was dehumanizing, and something which was proximate to the Nazi ideology. Let us forget about that. But Satyajit was very fascinated about the potential of the lines and the points and the directionalities and the parallelisms, the shapes and the sizes that would have the capability of producing feelings, and perceptions of certain kinds. I'm reminded of once again Raymond Williams's um, wonderful chapter in his Marxism and Literature called "Structures of Feelings," which of course is no way connected to what I'm saying, but that kind of a phrase is something which is tempting. Anyway, so if you listen to Satyajit Rai's background music, there seems to be a certain graphical element, kind of from point to point lines, and they're parallelly creating some kind of a polyphonic structure. What one could possibly, this particular, there is no time, I'm not going to show that. You can just go back and look into some of the Gestalt designs and see that how, and look back once again into the way Satyajit Rai was designing and he was a great master of calligraphy and designing and illustration, was designing the covers of Sandesh Potrika and Ekon and very many covers of many books and posters, where, so that kind of a graphical element, and the graphical element in his music, I suppose, have that kind of a, once again, a homology, a kind of a structural correspondence, which I'm not quite sure of, but it's just a provocation. And I want to be desperately provocative here, and talking about the idea of film as drawing, film form as drawing from musical forms. So here, the musical form drawing from visual forms. So these kinds of correspondences, cross correspondence, something which is yet to be worked upon. And I think that's one of the areas on which I could actually work. One last point, which in fact is quite a long point, but I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to stay on that point for long, just going to finish it in 5 minutes time. Is this whole idea of the comprehensibility, to which I suppose I have referred already, is that Satyajit's worry about losing audience, and he thinks that it cannot just be cerebral just for being cerebral. He had this whole project of, I would say, simplification. One can remember Upendra Kishore's project of, he wrote books like Shikhok Betireke Harmonium Shikha, Shikhok Betireke Behala Shikha. So how to be self-taught. Satyajit himself was a self-taught musician, music composer, and to make life simple, to make things simple. How one can play certain instruments without, and in such Gurubadi Desh, you are actually talking about how to train yourself. I think this is something which Upendra Kishore pioneered almost formally by writing books. Is something which, of course, you will get many instances of in Bortala as well. Um, um, so this whole project of simplification is something which is not much talked about, is also a project of modernity, intelligibility, comprehensibility. People should understand, and especially Satyajit says that this is far more of a job for me because I'm a filmmaker. Film is a mass art. It's not poetry. So people have to understand it, and I have to constantly keep that in mind. One can also remember the critique that he had of the Indian New Wave filmmakers, the movement that started from 1969, Emergence, Uski, the Mrinal Sen's Bhuvan Shom, and Monika's Uski. He said that this is something that I always keep in mind, that I cannot ignore the fact that things have to be simple. So I had, if in the question answer session, if you ask me, I can talk about this very idea of problem solving, his fascination about puzzles and how to make things uh, simple, how to make things comprehensible. For instance, uh, Shuri Babu actually draws our attention to a very interesting um, thing. In Upendra Kishore, Gupi was actually far more. Um, Gupi was clever, was a clever guy, and Bagha was not as much. But it kind of changes in case of in the film. Gupi Gain, Bagha Bain. Satyajit was asked, "Why did you do it?" Satyajit had this very, I don't know, a very peculiar notion about music. A singer said that গাইয়ে মানুষ একটু সাদাসিধে হয় না. So he said that, well, so this person should be simpler. He uses the word simpleton. Okay. Um, uh, maybe it comes from this whole project. One can also talk about it, like stretch one's imagination to this whole Brahmo project of reforming Hinduism, reforming broadly, let's say questioning any kind of mysticism or this whole Brahminical project, Brahminical mysticism. সহজ করে না. He in fact praised Rabindra Sangeet because he said that Rabindra Sangeet, what Rabindra Sangeet does is যা কিছুই আছে, এটা এত সম্ভার, দুরূহ শাস্ত্রীয় সঙ্গীত, পাশ্চাত্য বা প্রাচ্য যাই হোক না কেন, একটা খুব ইন্টারেস্টিং ফ্রেজ ব্যবহার করেছিলেন, আরো সহজ করে নেওয়া, আরো মোলায়েম করে নেওয়া, টু মেক ইট সফটার, টু মেক ইট ইজিয়ার, টু মেক ইট সিম্পল. So I think there could be instances and instances that one could cite, but I think I could end by referring to the lyric that Satyajit Rai wrote in for Gupi Gain Bagha Bain, one of the songs, of course, where he says that সে যে সুরেরই ভাষা, ছন্দেরই ভাষা, প্রাণেরই ভাষা, আনন্দেরই ভাষা, ভাষা এমন কথা বলে বোঝে যে সকলে, উঁচা নিচা ছোট বড় সমান, ওরা সেই ভাষাতেই করি গান. So music should be like that for him, and exposition should be like that for him. And this is possibly at this centenary moment, I suppose this is becoming more and more contextual. So, I mean, this whole discussion about public intellectual, to take intellectual things to the wider mass of people, is becoming increasingly important for us at this hour of the crisis for democracy, crisis for the culture of protest at the moment which we're witnessing in our country at this moment. Possibly also eclecticism is something which is being trampled upon in such a multifarous country like ours, in terms of everything, in terms of culture, language, songs, religion, everything. Um, it's one world order is emerging, one India, one country is being forced upon us. Satyajit Rai, people like Satyajit Rai, and more engagement with his aesthetics is bound to enrich us and engage with the contemporary politics. More and more, I think that would be one way of paying tribute. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abhijit. That was quite a fascinating presentation, and I would say deeply nuanced. Since we are really running out of time, I would just say one or two sentences, and because it's really impossible to summarize your paper like that. But I think you have started with Satyajit Rai's thoughts on music and how he incorporates those in his films. You have talked about eclecticism. You have talked about musical memory and his way of viewing his, thinking who is his audience and their comprehensibility. And very interestingly, you talked about polyphony, which is, many pieces playing together and but going hand in hand and often harmonizing. And I really like this as a as a literal word, literally and metaphorically. Um, you talk about the mapping of visual onto music and many other things that I will not go into now because you have gone into all those in great details. Uh, I think you are talking about, you are trying to define a modernity, project of modernity, and how he is trying to fit into that, or sometimes actually not fitting into that, expanding its horizons, And so this is an extremely complex thing, and you have brought out many dimensions of it. I was really fascinated by this visual to music translation, and many things that I didn't know. I learned from this lecture. But as I said, we are running out of time, so I will open the session to questions. I myself have a question to you, but that can wait, and I should not take the advantage of just because I'm chairing this session, I shouldn't take the advantage. So priorities will be given to others. So many of you have raised your hand. I think some of you are here. Do you want to put across the questions? Please feel free to do that now. No one?
No. Actually, I was allowing others to question.
Okay, so
I have a question.
Yeah.
Definitely, sir. Abhijit, thank you so much. That was like, my fight was worth it, I would say. But I have a question, which is, I you have mentioned the word challenge and how it was a challenge for him to, and you have pointed out how he overcame those challenges in various ways. That is, a moving towards a more visual media, uh, then incorporating both the Western and Eastern. But I was also thinking, uh, breaking away from the modernist view of things, that he also must have had a challenge of trying to do a score and create a music which had to be very markedly different from the Adhunik Bangla Gan, Adhunik Bangla cinema Gan, and the Hindi cinema and its music, which was being produced and which was mass consumption. So on one hand, he was obviously trying to get that mass together into for his films into the theater. He was trying to appeal to that mass in many ways. Uh, but on the other hand, he also had to overcome that challenge to create something completely different, which wouldn't even be recognized as the kind of music which was popular at the time, all through the decades, I would say. And গিটারকে বাদ দেওয়া হয়তো সেটার জন্যই খুব important, because guitar was growing to become more and more important than the sitar and the piano. You're muted, sir.
Sorry, it's a difficult question, and I've really not pondered over this. But this is something which is which should provoke a lot of thinking. I think that he was pretty aware of the kind of Hindi film music and Bengali popular, especially Bengali popular film music. You know, and he used to watch a lot of them also, though you don't find much reference to those by him. I'm not sure whether he was constantly trying to avoid that, though, that kind of structure or that kind of a framework, but at least it was, one can be sure that given his upbringing, and it's not, and I never see this as a kind of a personal upbringing, and I mean, you can actually refer to a certain world, you know, a certain world of taste, where there are, and he does refer to them also, you know, he refers to the Rai Poribar and the, you know, the larger society, quote unquote society, of that kind of a milieu, which had a kind of a taste from which such a kind of musical, you know, oeuvre would come out, you know. So, but one should, and this is a very important question, one might actually go and see whether there would be such a time where he would give in to the popular pleasure of a certain kind, but he would once again now shy away and say, no, that is not my cup of tea. I'll stick to what I'm more comfortable with. I'm not sure about that, but at least I think I won't use the word naturally, but uh, that kind of the modern upbringing in terms of the melange of the East and the West, in terms of being privy, in fact, he was privy to Kirtan, he was privy to Ramprasadi Gan, he was privy to you know, Ramoner Gan, he was privy to Brahmo Sangit and Lokogan, and at the same time Western classical music. Somebody who's able to read the scores and in his mind able to listen, and of course going to Indian classical music concerts. I'm sure that I mean, he would represent a pinnacle of that kind of sensibility, but there are many others, and he himself refers to many of them. That kind of a social milieu would definitely produce some musical sort of richness that was reflected in his oeuvre. And but his relationship with Hindi popular film songs and Bengali popular film songs is to be explored further. That has not been worked upon. Yes, thank you for asking that question. But the guitar point is very important. Yes, that seems to be conscious. That seems to be conscious.
Excuse me.
Yes, yes, go ahead.
Just a little observation, if I may add to this. I had read somewhere that when Ray started to make movies, or the kind of movies and all the other paraphernalia required, his intention was never to be esoteric. And I think I agree with Sir where you say it was his sensibility which was enriched and which was of a certain type, which was expressed in a certain type. So I really don't know, and of course I'm not aware of that comparison with the Hindi film songs and the Bengali film songs. But yeah, his intention, he says, was not to be esoteric.
Yes, I mean this is the point that I was trying to make, is that I mean it's not, of course, I was trying to make. In fact, whatever I said today, maybe just 10 to 15% of the points were something that I thought of on my points, but otherwise, I mean, I relied heavily on his own interviews and his own thoughts, and I just thought that this is a kind of a platform in which I would, you know, I mean, as a beginning, just to kind of, just acquaint the audience and myself with his thoughts on music. So if there are more such discussions ever, one can go deeper into now applications and, now sort of, going to his films and things like that. So yes, at least going by his what he says, he made it quite clear and constantly underlines the fact that I want to reach a wider audience, and he reached wider audience, but he never said that I want to reach wider audience in the sense of, kind of the popular, the audience, the extent of audience that the popular films enjoy. He was pretty sure of that. He knew that it was the urban, educated, Bengali, middle class kind of audience, which in itself is limited. But that kind of audience. But he always had that kind of wish that he would reach a wider audience. Possibly also because of the fact that he had in mind, the back of his mind, that he was not able to reach a section of the audience. Maybe that was the case. But yes, you were true that you were right when you say that he never intended to be esoteric. In fact, I mean, I haven't discussed many of his writings, essays on Indian film, especially his critique of the Indian New Wave. He thought that they were trying to be esoteric. They were trying to ignore the larger audience, mass audience. You know, so he liked to make popular films. Um, some of them might actually land up not being, um, might actually land up being cerebral, and that's why I always have a feeling that both of these layers, and they are not in conflict with each other. Pathet Panchali, for instance, actually did, if you go by sort of box office and the figures, I mean, it did, I mean, quite a good business, and I mean, many films of his actually. So if that is taken to be a yardstick, he believed that there should not be a conflict, and there is no conflict, and I can explore all kinds of psychological nuances, the crisis of the present times, uh, without compromising the audience, which is a tough thing to do. It's a very, very difficult thing to do, but it has been his pursuit all his life.
Okay. Others? Yeah, Varnuna. Yeah.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to thank Vijita for his wonderful session. It was really nice hearing to him. But I was just wondering if it is because of the reason that in reaching out to the wider audience, Ray has, through his musical composition, which are being used in his films, have tried to make his characters more familiar to viewers through music, so that whenever we are hearing the music, be it a thematic songs and the music that are being used in the background, we could instantly recollect the characters without even watching the films. So that makes it very interesting, like how music is speaking in terms of his films that he's been projecting.
This is one of the, yeah, please go ahead, yes.
And this is a little query that I was just wondering. And another thing that since we have been talking about Rabindra Sangeet and the Indian classical music, one of the very general difference between the two is that the Indian classical music emphasizes more on the variations on the musical notes, which are highly being used by in race films through his backgrounds particularly. And while Rabindra Sangeet has a rich lyrical content, uh, is that one of the reason, or is it because of his time-bound position that Ray had extensively explored and used Tagore's music, or Tagore songs in particular, in mostly in Tagore's novels, which he had picturized, and in situation in which dialogue seems to be superseded by the lyrics?
So these are two questions. Briefly, the first one is, of course, the key purpose of the theme song is to as you know, there are two purposes, of course. I mean, the one is to associate with the theme of the film, which is more abstract. It's very difficult to do. But the other thing is the most common is to associate with particular characters, you know, so that, as you were saying, that whenever a particular theme song, theme piece, theme music is heard, it brings in association of a particular situation or a scene or a character or a theme, whatever. So there is this whole logic of economization that you want to kind of, yes, so familiarization, economization, you're absolutely right when you say that. So that is one of the major purposes. There's no doubt about this. And in fact, this is one major point that I forgot to mention, is that the kind of realism Satyajit Rai practices, or even you can go to the extent of, you know, this is a risky, but anyway, you can go to the extent of suggesting even the kind of populism not in the sense of political populism, you know, that kind of a rhetoric or a discourse. Forget about that. But I'm saying that the kind of penchant for the popular that he had is to be understood in terms of waves of associations. যেটা আমি একটা বাংলা প্রবন্ধে লিখেছিলাম, অনুষঙ্গের প্রবাহ, অর্থাৎ একটা 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 উপরিভাগে সুপারফিশিয়াল কোথাও একটা কিছু দেখতে পাচ্ছি, বাস্তবিক মনে হচ্ছে, কিন্তু আরো দুটো তিনটে লেয়ার আছে, সেটা সেকেন্ড বা থার্ড ভিউইং এ হয়, বা তখনই হয়তো আমরা কেউ দেখতে পারি, he always makes this distinction with somebody who's a trained spectator and somebody who's not, তার কাছে কিন্তু অনেক রকম অ্যাসোসিয়েশন অনুষঙ্গের পরও জড়িয়ে সেগুলো আসবে। Theme music is one of those examples which is at a basic minimum level. I mean, it plays and it brings back memories of a particular character, association, scene, whatever. But this is not important. That is fine. But I'm saying that more than that, broadly what happens is that Ray works with this whole crisscrossing of associations. And you got, once again, if you read Shivaji Bandyopadhyay's article on, essay on the memory game in Aranya Dinratri, and you would see that how such crisscrossing of associations, memories, is something which is kind of sewn into the body of the text by Ray. That is his idea of realism. We cannot, talk much today about his idea of realism, which I completely skipped. In fact, my presentation remains inadequate without referring to his idea of realism. But I think your question, provoked me into thinking in terms of Ray's realism, which is about, and you are saying familiarization, bringing memories, associations, creating associations of associations. Second is, what was that? Sorry. Just give me one word, please.
Well, second query was basically related to the exploring Rabindra Sangeet in his films.
Why Rabindra Sangeet? Yes. I think one of the reasons, of course, was the very basic reason, of course, is his liking, and liking not as a kind of a personal choice, but also because he thought that Tagore's project is his, and which I suppose I have been able to establish to a certain extent in terms of the project of modernization, in terms of the project of eclecticism, in terms of the project of combination, fusion, whatever you call it. But there is another reason, is that you would see that because I mean, Charulata, in one sense, it's a period film, so you would find Tagore song, fitting into it. Somebody singing a Tagore song, actually contemporary Robi Babur gan gaichen, sure. But when you listen to a Tagore song in Kanchenjunga being used, Tagore constantly comes back precisely because of the fact that he believes that Tagore is right at the heart of a certain taste of a certain culture. শিক্ষিত মধ্যবিত্ত ভদ্রলোক শ্রেণীর মার্জিত রুচির প্রকাশ, এই কথাটাকে উনি অ্যাসোসিয়েট করছেন রবীন্দ্রসঙ্গীতের সঙ্গে। উনি মনে করেন যে ওনার যে অডিয়েন্স, সেই অডিয়েন্সের ভেতরের ভাব ভাবনা whatever, if that needs to be if that has to come out, the most representative sort of cultural, lyrical, aesthetic expression of that would be through Tagore songs. I think that is one of the reasons why it keeps recurring.
Okay, so we have to close this because we are really getting late. I myself had a question, but I will ask that later. So we have come to the very end of our fascinating and I would say this, extremely captivating webinar, for me at least. Both the speakers, I thanked them profusely, Abhijit and Professor Sanujjaman. And I would now request Shrobana Mujumdar, our colleague, to deliver the vote of thanks and end this webinar. Please, Shrobana.
Hope I'm audible. On behalf of the Cultural Committee, Barasat Government College, I'd like to thank the speakers for delivering two wonderful lectures and making this event possible. I'd also like to express our sincere gratitude to Dr. Krishnendu Dotto, Principal, Government General Degree College, Kalna, for giving us the permission to use their institute's Google Workspace, which enabled recording of this event. I would like to thank the Infotech Lab for their technical support and Shudip Topal, our student, for the flyer. Our colleague Dr. Shomaditya De and Dr. Shudip Mukherjee has given us the usual and constant support, and a very thanks to both of them. Thanks to our principal sir, Dr. Shamar Chattopadhyay, who has been a source of sustained help and encouragement throughout. Finally, I take this opportunity to thank our students, staff, and all the participants from both sides of the borders. Once again, thank all of you. Have a very pleasant evening ahead. Thank you.
Thanks to the organizers. Thanks everybody for attending. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Asanuzzaman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor.